Sometimes the greatest humiliation becomes the perfect disguise. Sometimes a man must crawl before he can truly stand tall. In a Norse feast hall, a giant slave serves ale to his masters while they laugh and spit on him. They treat him like an animal, never knowing his true identity. This broken thrall is actually Jorund Skallgrimsson, the exiled son of a betrayed jarl. He has returned from distant lands not for simple revenge, but to see if those who destroyed his family still feast on stolen honor. The chains on his wrists are real, but so is the fire burning in his heart. When the truth finally comes out by the hearthfire, these proud kinsmen will learn that some debts can only be paid in full. What happens when the most powerful man in the room is the one everyone thinks is powerless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The great hall of Rigvol stood like a monument to prosperity, its massive oak beams rising into the shadows where smoke from the central fire curled toward the high roof. Tapestries depicting glorious battles hung from the walls, their rich colors glowing in the flickering light of dozens of oil lamps and torches. The scent of roasted meat, fresh bread, and strong ale filled the air, mingling with the warmth of bodies and the low rumble of conversation that echoed off the stone foundations. At the high table, Jarl Sigmar the Bold sat in his carved chair, his greying beard carefully braided with silver rings that caught the firelight. 20 years had passed since he'd claimed this holding, 20 years of good harvests and profitable raids that had transformed Rigvol from a modest settlement into one of the most prosperous strongholds in the northern territories. The golden, drinking horn that sat before him, an ornate vessel passed down through generations, reflected his success in every gleaming curve. Around the long tables that filled the hall, his kinsmen and honored guests raised their voices in celebration. This was no ordinary feast, but a gathering of the bloodline, a chance for families scattered across distant holdings to come together and share in their collective triumph. Young warriors fresh from their first raids sat alongside battle-scarred veterans, while the women of the household moved gracefully between the tables, ensuring cups never emptied and platters remained full. Another round for our guests. Sigmar called out, his voice carrying easily across the hall. Let none say that Rigvol's hospitality has grown thin with our prosperity. The response was immediate. Cups raised high, voices lifted in approval. These were men who understood that wealth meant nothing without the ability to share it, that a jarl's reputation rested as much on his generosity as his strength in battle. They had earned their place at this table through blood and loyalty, through victories won and enemies defeated. But it was not the freeborn warriors who caught the most attention this evening. Chained near the serving tables stood a massive figure, recently acquired from traders who'd brought exotic goods from the eastern routes. The thrall was enormous, even by Norse standards, easily a head taller than the largest man in the hall, with shoulders that strained the coarse fabric of his slave tunic. His dark hair hung loose and unkempt, partially hiding a face marked by old scars that spoke of violence survived. Look at the size of that one, laughed Gunnar, Sigmar's nephew, pointing with his drinking horn. What giant sired such a beast? He could probably carry an ox on those shoulders. The slave's name, they'd been told, was Grim, a fitting appellation for such a grim-faced creature. Since his arrival 3 days ago, he had spoken perhaps a dozen words, following orders with sullen obedience, but showing none of the broken spirit that marked a properly trained thrall. There was something unsettling about his silence, something that made even the boldest warriors avoid direct eye contact when he served their ale. He looks half wild, observed Eric Ironhand, an older warrior whose missing left hand testified to years of combat. Mark my words, that one will need watching. I've seen his type before. They seem broken until they're not. Sigmar waved dismissively. The traders assured me he was well trained. Besides, what harm can one chained slave do in a hall full of armed men? Let him pour our ale and clear our plates. If he gives trouble, We'll remind him of his place. The slave in question moved between the tables with careful steps, his chains creating a soft, metallic whisper with each movement. To the casual observer, he appeared to be exactly what he seemed, a defeated warrior reduced to serving his betters. But behind his downcast eyes, Jorund Skallgrimsson observed everything with the keen attention of a man whose life depended on understanding his enemies. 20 years since he'd last stood in this hall, though then he'd been at his father's side, a young warrior learning the ways of leadership and honor. The tapestries were different now, depicting victories that had come after his family's fall. The faces around the tables showed the passage of time, some familiar despite the years, others belonging to a new generation that had grown up hearing only one version of ancient events, but the golden drinking horn that remained unchanged. Jorund remembered it well, remembered how it had sat before his father during countless feasts, how the old jarl had used it to toast victories and mourn fallen comrades. To see it now in Sigmar's hands was like watching a grave robber wear the bones of the dead. "More ale, slave," called out a young warrior Jorund didn't recognize, holding out his cup with the casual arrogance of youth. "And mind you don't spill it on my cloak. This silk came from Byzantium." Jorund approached with measured steps, pitcher in hand, eyes properly downcast. As he poured, the young man continued his boasting to his companions. "My grandfather always said the best thralls were those who'd once been something more. Break a warrior's spirit completely, and you have a servant who knows the value of what he's lost. This one probably commanded men once, maybe even ruled some miserable patch of rocks somewhere in the east." The irony was so sharp, it took all of Jorund's discipline not to smile. If only this pup knew that the miserable patch of rocks he'd once ruled was the very hall where he now served as slave. If only he understood that the broken warrior pouring his ale had commanded respect from Byzantium to the Baltic, that kings and emperors had sought his counsel in the years of his exile. But revelation would come in its own time. For now, Jorund was content to listen and learn. Each conversation revealed something useful: who held real power, who harbored resentments, who might be turned against the others when the time came. The techniques he'd learned in the eastern courts served him well here. Patience and observation were often more powerful than the sharpest sword. "Remember old Jorund Skallgrim," one of the older warriors was saying, his voice thick with ale and nostalgia. "Now there was a jarl worth following. Shame how he met his end, but I suppose that's what comes of trusting the wrong people." The words hit Jorund like a physical blow. His father, discussed so casually, reduced to a cautionary tale about misplaced trust. He forced his hands to remain steady as he continued serving, but inside, the careful control he'd maintained began to crack. These men spoke of his father's death as if it were ancient history, a lesson learned and forgotten. "Bjorn was a fool," Gunnar declared, his young voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "A good warrior, I'll grant you, but he never understood that times change. He clung to old ways when the world demanded new thinking." The pitcher, in Jorund's hands, trembled slightly, ale sloshing against the rim. 20 years of discipline, 20 years of learning patience in foreign courts and distant battlefields, and still his nephew's casual dismissal of his father threatened to shatter his composure. "Easy, boy," Gunnar laughed, noticing the slave's trembling hands. "Don't let talk of dead jarls frighten you. Those days are long past, and wiser men rule now." Jorund nodded mutely, stepping back to continue his service. But the damage was done. The careful emotional distance he'd maintained since arriving at Rigvol had been breached. These weren't just political enemies anymore. They were the men who had stolen his inheritance, destroyed his family, and now sat in judgment over his father's memory. As the evening progressed, the ale flowed more freely, and tongues loosened accordingly. Jorund learned that his enemies had prospered beyond his wildest imagination. Sigmar's holdings now stretched across 3 valleys, his influence reaching into the courts of distant jarls. The wealth that should have been his father's legacy had been used to build an empire built on betrayal. To absent friends, Sigmar called out near midnight, raising the golden horn high, to those who fell so that we might feast in peace. The toast was echoed throughout the hall, but Jorund heard in it a mockery of everything his father had stood for. The peace they celebrated was built on treachery. The friends they honored were the very men they'd betrayed. As he moved through the shadows, serving and observing, Jorund felt the weight of his true mission settling on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. This was why he'd returned. Not for simple revenge that could have been accomplished with hired assassins or a midnight raid. He'd come to see with his own eyes how completely his enemies had claimed his legacy, how thoroughly they'd erased his family's memory from the world. The knowledge would make what came next all the more satisfying. Near the servants' entrance, young Astrid, Sigmar's daughter, intercepted him as he carried empty platters toward the kitchens. Unlike the others, she looked at him with something approaching kindness, her blue eyes holding a sympathy that seemed genuine. "You look weary," she said softly. "The work is hard when you're not used to it." Jorund met her gaze briefly, noting the intelligence there, the humanity that marked her as different from her kinsmen. Here was a complication he hadn't anticipated, genuine goodness among his enemies. "It would have been easier if they were all monsters. I manage, my lady," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. She studied his face for a moment longer than was proper. "You're not like the other thralls. There's something—" She paused, shaking her head. "Forgive me. I shouldn't keep you from your duties." As she walked away, Jorund realized that his disguise, perfect as it was, might not fool everyone indefinitely. Astrid had seen something in him that spoke of his true nature. If she continued to watch him closely, it might complicate his plans considerably. But for now, his secret was safe. The feast continued around him. His enemies celebrated their prosperity. And Jorund served ale with the patience of a man who had learned to wait 20 years for justice. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to observe and plan. Tonight, it was enough to stand in his father's hall and remember what had been stolen from him. The third day of feasting brought an unexpected twist that would shatter Jorund's careful composure. As the midday meal was being prepared, old Ragnar the Wise, one of Sigmar's most trusted advisors, rose from his seat with a drinking horn filled to the brim. "My friends," Ragnar began, his weathered voice carrying the authority of his years, "before we feast again, let us remember why we gather. 20 summers have passed since this hall was cleansed of treachery, since weak leadership gave way to strength." A hush fell over the assembled warriors. Even the servants paused in their duties as Ragnar's words commanded attention. "I propose a toast," he continued, "to the wisdom that saw through false loyalty, to the courage that acted when action was needed, to the defeat of Jorund Skallgrimsson and all who would have led us into ruin." The words struck Jorund like hammer blows. From his position near the serving tables, he watched in growing horror as cups were raised throughout the hall. These men weren't just celebrating their prosperity, they were celebrating his father's death, to Bjorn's defeat. The hall echoed, voices raised in unanimous agreement. Jorund's hands tightened on the ale pitcher he carried, his knuckles white beneath the scarred skin. The casual cruelty of it, to turn his father's murder into a feast day, tradition, threatened to overwhelm the discipline he'd spent 20 years building, but worse was yet to come. "Bring out the trophies," Sigmar commanded, gesturing to the servants. "Let our young men see what becomes of those who choose the wrong side." From a side chamber, several thralls emerged carrying items that made Jorund's blood turn to ice. His father's war banner, torn and stained but unmistakable. The silver arm rings that had been gifted to Bjorn by the King of Dublin. Most painful of all, his father's favorite drinking cup, a simple wooden vessel that the old jarl had claimed was worth more than all the gold in his treasury because it had been carved by Jorund's mother. "These belong to a man who put honor before wisdom," Sigmar announced, holding up the wooden cup, "who chose loyalty to the old ways over the prosperity of his people." See how such stubbornness ends. The cup was passed around the table like a curiosity, each man examining it with the detached interest one might show a captured enemy's weapon. They laughed at its simplicity, mocked the idea that such a plain thing could have value. Jorund felt something breaking inside his chest. Not just anger that he could have controlled. This was grief, raw and overwhelming, at seeing his father's memory so thoroughly defiled. The cup had been his mother's last gift to her husband before the fever took her. His father had drunk from it every evening, telling young Jorund stories of better days, of hopes for the future. Now it was a joke, a symbol of foolishness passed around by men who couldn't understand its true worth. Careful there. Slave, Gunnar's voice cut through Jorund's anguish. You're spilling ale all over the floor. Jorund looked down to see that his hands were indeed shaking, ale splashing from the pitcher onto the rushes beneath his feet. Several of the feast guests were staring at him with varying degrees of amusement and irritation. "What's wrong with the giant?" asked Eric Ironhand. "Does talk of battle frighten him so much?" "Perhaps he knew Jorund Skallgrimsson," suggested another warrior, his tone mocking. "Maybe he served in his household before he learned the price of choosing the wrong master." The suggestion was closer to the truth than they knew, but spoken with such casual cruelty that it took all of Jorund's remaining self-control not to reveal himself then and there, to stand up, throw off his chains, and show them exactly what had become of Jorund Skallgrimsson's son. But he had not waited 20 years to waste his revenge on a moment of rage. "Clean that up," Sigmar ordered dismissively, "and try to keep your hands steady. We don't need our ale mixed with thralls trembling." As Jorund knelt to wipe up the spilled ale, he caught sight of something that stopped his heart. Hidden beneath one of the tables, wrapped in an oiled cloth, was a fragment of his father's personal banner. Not the war standard they'd displayed as a trophy, but the smaller pennant that had flown above their private quarters. The cloth bore the Skallgrim raven, worked in silver thread by his mother's own hands. The sight of it, discarded and forgotten beneath the table like refuse, completed the transformation that had been building in Jorund's heart. This wasn't just about reclaiming stolen property or evening old scores. This was about restoring honor to a memory that had been deliberately poisoned. "You seem affected by our stories, slave," came a new voice. Astrid had approached while he cleaned, her tone carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Forgive me." "My lady," Jorund replied, not trusting himself to say more. She studied his face for a long moment. "It's strange. When my father speaks of the old days, you react as if you've heard the stories before." The observation was dangerously perceptive. Jorund forced himself to meet her gaze, schooling his features into an expression of dull incomprehension. "I hear many stories, my lady. Wars and battles all sound much the same to simple folk." Astrid didn't seem convinced, but before she could press further, a commotion near the main entrance drew everyone's attention. A messenger had arrived, his horse lathered with sweat and his clothes showing the dust of hard travel. "My lord Sigmar," the messenger called out, bowing deeply. "I bring word from the southern borders. Eric Bloodaxe sends his greetings and requests safe passage through your lands." A chill seemed to settle over the hall at the mention of that name. Eric Bloodaxe was a legend, but not the kind of legend that brought comfort to sleeping households. His reputation was built on cunning and cruelty, on a willingness to do whatever necessary to achieve his goals. "Eric Bloodaxe," Sigmar repeated slowly. "What business brings him north?" "He claims to be pursuing raiders who've been troubling his southern holdings, my lord. Says they've fled into the disputed territories, and he seeks permission to continue the hunt." From his position on the floor, still pretending to clean spilled ale, Jorund felt a cold recognition wash over him. Eric Bloodaxe, the name that had haunted his dreams for 20 years, whispered in the courts of Byzantium and the trading posts of Kiev. His true enemy, the architect of his family's destruction, the puppet master who had manipulated Sigmar and his kinsmen into betraying their oaths. But Sigmar and his people didn't know that. They saw Eric as a powerful neighbor, someone to be treated with caution but not necessarily fear. They had no idea that their comfortable prosperity had been built on lies, that the man requesting passage was the same one who had orchestrated their rise to power. "Send word that he's welcome to pass through," Sigmar decided after a moment's consideration. "But make it clear that his hunt ends at our borders. We'll have no blood feuds spilling onto our lands." The messenger nodded and withdrew, but his words had already transformed the atmosphere in the hall. The carefree celebration of earlier was replaced by an undercurrent of tension, the awareness that the wider world was intruding on their isolated prosperity. For Jorund, the news changed everything. Eric's presence in the region was no coincidence. The man was too calculating for that. Either he'd learned of Jorund's return, or he was pursuing some other scheme that would affect everyone in this hall. Either way, the careful game of patience and observation that Jorund had been playing was about to become far more dangerous. His father's banner fragment, still hidden beneath the table, seemed to whisper reminders of what was at stake. Not just personal vengeance, but justice for a crime that had shaped 20 years of history. As the feast resumed around him, Jorund made his decision. The time for passive observation was ending. If Eric Bloodaxe was coming north, then the stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of everyone in this hall. The torn banner beneath the table would not remain hidden much longer. Soon, very soon, the raven of House Skallgrim would fly again. That night, as the hall settled into the quiet hours before dawn, Jorund made his way to the slave quarters with careful, measured steps. The chains that bound his wrists had become as familiar as breathing over the past days, but tonight they felt heavier than usual, weighted with the knowledge of what he'd witnessed. The other thralls were already asleep on their straw pallets, exhausted from days of serving the feast. Jorund settled into his designated corner, but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. Instead, he reached beneath his rough tunic and carefully withdrew a small silk purse, no larger than his palm, that he'd kept hidden since his arrival. The purse was filled with Eastern coins, gold Byzants from Constantinople, silver dirhams from the Caliphate, and precious stones that would buy a small kingdom. 20 years of exile had been profitable for a man who knew how to turn his warrior skills into mercantile success. The wealth represented power, resources that could be turned to his advantage when the time came. But for now, it served another purpose. As he examined the coins by the dim light filtering through the smoke hole, Jorund planned his next moves with the patience of a man who had learned to play long games. Can't sleep either. The whispered voice belonged to Olaf, an older thrall who had served in Sigmar's household for nearly 10 years. His weathered face bore the resigned expression of a man who had accepted his fate, but his eyes still held intelligence. "The feast troubles you," Olaf continued, settling beside Jorund. "I saw your face when they brought out the old jarl's things." "You knew him, didn't you?" Jorund studied the older man carefully. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, but information was always valuable. "I served in his household briefly before the end," Jorund replied carefully. "He was a good lord to his people." Olaf nodded slowly. "Aye, he was that. I was there when Sigmar's men came to claim the holding. Bjorn could have fought, could have made it costly for them. Instead, he walked out to meet them alone, hoping to spare his people the bloodshed. This was new information, details that Jorund had never heard. His father's final moments had been a mystery, the accounts given by Sigmar's men painting him as a desperate fool who died fighting overwhelming odds. What really happened that day? Jorund asked. "Treachery," Olaf said simply. Bjorn came under a flag of truce to negotiate terms. They cut him down while he was speaking. Then they claimed he'd drawn his sword first, that it was a fair fight. The revelation hit Jorund like a physical blow. His father hadn't died fighting. He'd been murdered during peace negotiations. The image he'd carried for 20 years, of his father dying with sword in hand, defending his hall, crumbled to reveal something far uglier. "Who else knows this?" Jorund whispered. "Few who live. Most of Bjorn's loyal men died that day, or disappeared soon after. Those of us who survived learned to keep our tongues still. Jorund carefully tucked the silk purse back beneath his tunic, his mind racing. If the truth of his father's death was known to the surviving thralls, then there were others who might be turned to his cause when the time came. Men who had served his family loyally, who harbored their own resentments against Sigmar's rule. "Tell me about the others," he said. "The ones who remember the old days." Over the next hour, Olaf painted a picture of Rigvol that was far different from the prosperous unity Sigmar projected. The older thralls were mostly former freemen who had been reduced to slavery after backing the wrong side. Many of the younger servants came from families that had been displaced when Sigmar consolidated his power. Resentments ran deep, kept carefully hidden beneath the surface of daily routine. "There's Magnus in the stables," Olaf explained. "He was one of Bjorn's horsemasters before they made him a thrall. Still knows more about breeding war horses than any free man in the territory. And Rolf in the kitchens. He commanded Bjorn's archers until the end." Each name was another potential ally, another piece on the board that Jorund could potentially move when the game began in earnest. But he would have to be careful. These men had survived 20 years by keeping their heads down and their mouths shut. Convincing them to risk everything would require more than just revealing his identity. The next morning brought new challenges as Jorund began to put his emerging plan into motion. During the morning meal, he made a point of serving the table where Gunnar sat with his companions, listening carefully to their conversation while maintaining his facade of simple obedience. "My father grows too trusting in his old age," Gunnar was saying, his voice pitched low, but not low enough to escape Jorund's trained hearing. "Allowing Eric Bloodaxe passage through our lands invites trouble." "Eric has always honored his agreements," replied one of his companions, "and we're strong enough to handle any problems he might bring." "Strength isn't the issue," Gunnar insisted. "It's what he represents. The old ways, the time when might made right without concern for consequences. We've built something better here, something more stable." The conversation revealed interesting dynamics within Sigmar's household. Gunnar clearly saw himself as more progressive than his elders, but his definition of progress seemed to include maintaining the prosperity built on his grandfather's betrayal. The contradiction would be useful when the time came to exploit divisions within the family. As Jorund moved between the tables, he began implementing subtle manipulations designed to increase tension among the feast guests. A whispered comment about one man's war story to another who had been there and remembered differently. A suggestion that someone's portion of meat was smaller than their neighbor's. Small provocations that would normally pass unnoticed, but which, multiplied across dozens of interactions, began to create an atmosphere of unease. The techniques were ones he'd learned in the Byzantine court, where survival often depended on the ability to turn allies against each other through careful manipulation. Applied to a Norse feast hall, they were remarkably effective. "You're unusually attentive for a thrall," Astrid observed as Jorund refilled her cup. She had been watching him more closely since the previous day's incident, her intelligent eyes tracking his movements with uncomfortable precision. "I try to serve well." "My lady," Jorund replied neutrally, "most slaves flinch when they're addressed directly. You don't. Most avoid eye contact with their betters. You meet my gaze as an equal would." The observation was dangerously accurate. Despite his years of practice, the habits of command were difficult to suppress entirely. Jorund had spent too many years being treated with respect to fully convincing himself he was truly a slave. "Perhaps I have not been properly broken yet," he said carefully. "Some men take longer to accept their fate than others." Astrid tilted her head, studying him. "Or perhaps you're not what you seem to be." Before Jorund could respond, a commotion near the main entrance drew everyone's attention. Magnus, the former horsemaster whom Olaf had mentioned, had burst into the hall despite his slave status. His face flushed with urgency. "My lord Sigmar!" Magnus called out, ignoring the angry shouts from the guards who pursued him. Riders approach under Eric Bloodaxe's banner. At least 50 men, all armed for war. The hall erupted into activity as warriors reached for weapons and servants scattered. Sigmar rose from his seat, his face grim with the realization that Eric's hunting party was larger and more dangerous than expected. "How long before they arrive?" Sigmar demanded. "They'll reach the gates within the hour, my lord," Magnus replied. "They ride hard, like men with purpose beyond simple passage." As preparations began around him, Jorund felt the familiar quickening of his pulse that came before battle. But this was not his fight, not yet. For now he remained the silent observer, the powerless thrall who would be overlooked while more important matters demanded attention. But in his hidden purse, the eastern gold seemed to whisper promises of power yet to be unleashed. Within the hour, the thunder of hooves announced Eric Bloodaxe's arrival. From his position among the serving thralls, Jorund watched through the narrow windows as 50 mounted warriors rode into Rigvol's courtyard with the confidence of men who expected welcome. At their head rode a figure that made Jorund's blood run cold with recognition. Eric Bloodaxe had aged in the 20 years since Jorund had last seen him, but the cruel intelligence in his pale eyes remained unchanged. His beard, now silver-streaked, was braided with iron rings that clinked softly as he moved. He sat his horse like a man born to command, surveying Sigmar's prosperous holding with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey. Jorund's hand moved instinctively to where his father's signet ring lay hidden beneath his rough tunic, pressed against his skin like a burning coal. The ring was the last tangible connection to his inheritance, the final proof of his identity. He had worn it through 20 years of exile, through battles in distant lands and negotiations in foreign courts. Now, seeing the man who had orchestrated his father's murder, the ring felt heavier than iron chains. "Welcome, Eric Bloodaxe," Sigmar called out, emerging from the hall with his household warriors arrayed behind him. "Your message spoke of pursuing raiders." Eric dismounted with fluid grace, his smile revealing teeth like yellowed ivory. "Indeed, friend Sigmar, but raiders have a way of multiplying when left unchecked. I find myself requiring more men than I initially anticipated." The lie was smoothly delivered, but Jorund caught the subtle tension in Eric's voice. This was no hunting expedition. It was a carefully planned operation with goals that went far beyond catching petty thieves. "My hall is open to you," Sigmar replied. Though Jorund detected reluctance beneath the traditional hospitality, "Though I confess surprise at the size of your company for such a task. Dangerous times require larger responses," Eric said, his eyes scanning the assembled defenders. "I trust you understand the wisdom of overwhelming force when dealing with uncertainty." As the two jarls spoke, Jorund noticed Eric's men positioning themselves with military precision. They weren't guests, they were an occupying force, and Sigmar's household was outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. Whatever Eric had planned, he intended to achieve it from a position of strength. The feast that evening took on a different character with Eric's presence. The easy camaraderie of previous nights was replaced by careful formality, with both groups of warriors watching each other with the wariness of dogs uncertain of their pack order. Jorund moved between the tables, serving ale and observing the complex dance of Norse politics unfolding around him. "You've done well for yourself." "Sigmar," Eric commented, raising the golden drinking horn, "this prosperity would make your predecessors envious." "The land provides for those who tend it wisely," Sigmar replied carefully, "though I suspect you didn't ride north to discuss agriculture." Eric's laugh was like the sound of steel on stone. "Direct as always. Very well. I seek information about old enemies, old debts that require settling. There are rumors that certain exiled bloodlines may be stirring again." The words sent ice through Jorund's veins. Eric knew. Somehow the man who had destroyed his family 20 years ago had learned of his return. This wasn't coincidence. It was a trap, carefully laid and precisely executed. "The past is buried, Eric," Sigmar said firmly. "The old feuds died with the men who started them." "Did they?" Eric's pale eyes swept the hall, lingering for a moment on the serving thralls. "I've learned never to assume the dead stay buried. Sometimes they return when least expected, wearing faces we don't recognize. Jorund forced himself to continue his service, pouring ale with steady hands while his mind raced. Eric's words were too specific to be general philosophy. The man was hunting, using Sigmar's hospitality as cover while he searched for his prey. But Eric wasn't the only one playing a deeper game. As the evening progressed, Jorund began to implement the next phase of his own plan. During a lull in the feast, he approached Gunnar's table where the young warriors were deep in their cups. "My lord," Jorund said quietly, "forgive the intrusion, but I overheard something that might interest you." Gunnar looked up with the slightly unfocused gaze of a man who had been drinking steadily. "What could a thrall overhear that would matter to free men?" "Eric Bloodaxe's warriors speak carelessly around slaves, my lord. They assume we don't understand the importance of what we hear." The hook was baited carefully. Gunnar's eyes sharpened with curiosity despite the ale. "What did you hear?" "Talk of this being more than a hunting expedition, my lord. Something about old claims and new opportunities. They seem to think your father's prosperity makes him vulnerable to certain pressures. It was a dangerous game, providing just enough truth to be credible, while steering Gunnar toward conclusions that served Jorund's purposes." The young man's face darkened as the implications sank in. "They spoke of my father as vulnerable." Gunnar's voice carried the barely controlled anger of wounded pride. "Perhaps I misunderstood, my lord," Jorund replied humbly. "My Norse is not as good as it should be, but the seed was planted." Gunnar's suspicion of Eric, already present, began to crystallize into active hostility. Jorund withdrew before the young man could question him further, leaving him to stew in his growing paranoia. Similar conversations followed throughout the evening. A word here, an observation there, each designed to increase tension between the two groups. Eric's men were indeed talking carelessly, their confidence making them indiscreet. Jorund gathered intelligence while appearing to simply perform his duties, learning about their true numbers, their plans, and their weaknesses. The most valuable information came from an unexpected source. Astrid, who had been quietly observing the interplay between the two groups of warriors, approached Jorund as he cleared tables near the end of the evening. "You're doing it again," she said softly. "Acting like you understand more than a simple slave should." Jorund met her gaze, recognizing that denial would be futile. "Perhaps some slaves have seen more of the world than others expect. Eric's arrival troubles you more than it troubles the others," she continued. "Why would a thrall care about the politics of jarls?" The question hung between them like a drawn blade. Astrid's intelligence was becoming a serious complication to his plans. But perhaps it could also be turned to advantage. "In my experience, my lady, when powerful men gather, it's the powerless who suffer the consequences. A slave learns to read the signs of coming trouble." Astrid studied his face in the flickering firelight. "You speak like a man who has been powerful himself. Your hands are scarred from sword work, not farm labor. Your bearing is that of someone accustomed to command." She was too perceptive by half, but her observations also revealed an opportunity. If she suspected his true nature, perhaps she could be guided toward the right conclusions at the right time. "Perhaps some men fall farther than others, my lady," he said quietly. "The higher you climb, the more painful the landing." Before she could respond, a commotion near Eric's table drew their attention. The northern jarl was deep in conversation with his closest advisors. Their voices too low to overhear, but their body language suggesting urgent planning. "Whatever he's truly here for," Astrid murmured. "It's not hunting raiders." "No," Jorund agreed, his hand unconsciously touching the hidden ring beneath his tunic. "It's not." As the evening wound down and the two groups of warriors settled into an uneasy peace, Jorund retreated to the slave quarters with a wealth of new information and a growing certainty that events were accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control them. Eric's presence had transformed the careful game he'd been playing into something far more dangerous. But danger brought opportunity for those bold enough to seize it. The signet ring pressed against his skin seemed to pulse with the weight of his father's legacy, reminding him that some debts could only be paid in full. The morning after Eric's arrival brought an unexpected development that would accelerate Jorund's plans beyond his careful schedule. As he served the morning meal, Jorund observed Eric producing a set of bone-carved dice from his purse. Their surfaces yellowed with age and marked with intricate runes. "Sigmar, old friend," Eric called out with deceptive joviality. "Surely your young warriors would welcome some entertainment while we discuss business. These dice have brought me considerable fortune over the years." The dice themselves were beautiful pieces of craftsmanship, but Jorund's trained eye caught subtle irregularities in their weight distribution. They were loaded, designed to fall in predetermined patterns for those who knew their secrets. Eric was preparing to fleece Sigmar's men while simultaneously gathering information about their loyalties and weaknesses. Gunnar, still bristling with suspicion from Jorund's carefully planted seeds of doubt, accepted the challenge with the reckless confidence of youth. "I'll match any wager you care to make, Eric Bloodaxe. Our dice run as true as our swords." "Excellent," Eric smiled, and Jorund caught the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Shall we start with something modest? Say, the value of a good horse?" What followed was a masterclass in manipulation. Eric allowed Gunnar and his companions to win several early rounds, building their confidence while subtly encouraging larger wagers. The loaded dice performed their function perfectly, appearing random, while gradually transferring wealth from Sigmar's men to Eric's purse. But the true purpose wasn't financial. As the game progressed, Eric skillfully steered the conversation towards sensitive topics. Who among Sigmar's warriors could be trusted in a crisis? What were the defensive capabilities of Rigvol's fortifications? Which neighboring jarls might provide aid if trouble arose? The young warriors, emboldened by ale and initial winnings, answered with the thoughtless honesty of men who believed they were among friends. Jorund watched in fascination as Eric methodically catalogued every weakness in Sigmar's position, while appearing to do nothing more than enjoy a friendly game. "You know," Eric mused as he rolled another suspiciously favorable combination, "this reminds me of the old days, before the recent troubles. Do you boys remember hearing stories about Jorund Skallgrim? Now there was a man who knew how to play the games that mattered. The mention of his father's name made Jorund's blood quicken, but he forced himself to continue serving with steady hands. My grandfather spoke of him," one of the younger warriors replied. "Said he was too honorable for his own good. Trusted the wrong people and paid the price." "Honorable, yes," Eric agreed, his tone carefully neutral. "But perhaps not as trusting as people believe. I heard rumors that he had contingency plans, hidden resources that were never found after his unfortunate end." Jorund's mind raced as he processed this information. Eric was fishing, probing to see if anyone knew about potential assets that Bjorn might have hidden away. The implication was clear. The northern jarl believed there were still secrets to be uncovered, advantages to be gained from properly understanding the past. "What kind of resources?" Gunnar asked, his curiosity overcoming his caution. "Oh, the usual things ambitious jarls accumulate," Eric replied casually. "Gold hidden from tax collectors, alliances with distant powers, perhaps even surviving family members with legitimate claims to stolen properties." The last phrase was delivered with such studied casualness that Jorund nearly dropped the pitcher he carried. Eric wasn't just hunting for Jorund. He was actively baiting a trap, using the possibility of Skallgrim survivors to gauge reactions and identify potential threats. Bjorn had no surviving family, Sigmar interjected from the high table, his voice carrying a warning tone. His bloodline ended with him, of course, Eric agreed smoothly. Though one hears stories, rumors of sons who might have escaped the final reckoning. Probably nothing more than wishful thinking from those who preferred the old ways. The game continued, but Jorund could see that Eric's attention was now divided between the dice and careful observation of everyone in the hall. The man was hunting, using multiple strategies simultaneously while maintaining the facade of friendly visitation. During a brief lull in the gaming, Jorund made his way to the kitchens, where Rolf, the former archer commander, was supervising the preparation of the midday meal. The man looked up as Jorund approached, his weathered face showing the wariness that came from years of keeping dangerous secrets. "You're the new thrall," Rolf observed quietly. "The one who asks too many questions about the old days. Perhaps I'm curious about what really happened," Jorund replied carefully. "A man likes to understand the history of the place where he serves." Rolf studied him for a long moment, then glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "History is a dangerous subject these days, especially with Eric Bloodaxe in residence. That one has eyes like a hawk and a memory longer than winter. You know him?" "I knew his reputation. They say he can smell deception from across a hall, that he's never met a loyalty he couldn't purchase or a secret he couldn't uncover." Rolf's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "If you're anything other than what you appear to be, boy, you'd best be very careful indeed." The warning was clearly meant as friendly advice, but it also confirmed Jorund's growing realization that his time for subtle manipulation was running short. Eric's presence had accelerated the timeline beyond his original plans. "What would you do," Jorund asked carefully, "if someone offered you a chance to serve your true lord again?" Rolf's eyes sharpened with sudden intensity. "I'd ask what proof they offered that such service would be more than a path to the grave." It was the response Jorund had hoped for, cautious but not dismissive. Here was a man who might be turned to his cause when the moment was right, provided he could offer sufficient evidence of both identity and capability. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the main hall. Eric's voice had risen in what sounded like genuine anger, though Jorund suspected it was carefully calculated for effect. "You accuse me of cheating," Eric was saying as Jorund and Rolf hurried back to observe. "That's a serious charge to level against a guest in your father's hall." Gunnar stood swaying slightly, his face flushed with ale and anger. "Those dice fall too favorably for chance. Lugmen is that fortunate without assistance." The accusation hung in the air like the smell of smoke before fire. Eric's warriors tensed visibly, hands moving closer to weapons, while Sigmar's men prepared to support their kinsmen despite the obvious diplomatic disaster unfolding. "Perhaps," Eric said with dangerous quiet, "young Gunnar would prefer to settle this matter in a more traditional fashion. Steel speaks clearer than bone, after all." It was exactly the escalation Eric had been maneuvering toward, a legitimate excuse for violence that would give him justification for whatever he planned next. Jorund watched in growing alarm as the careful political balance of the past days crumbled into the potential for immediate bloodshed. "There will be no drawn steel in my hall over a gambling dispute," Sigmar declared firmly, but Jorund could hear the strain in his voice. The Jarl was caught between supporting his nephew and maintaining diplomatic relations with a dangerous neighbor. "Of course not," Eric agreed with mock reasonableness. "Though I find it unfortunate that Rigvol's hospitality comes seasoned with unfounded accusations. The crisis passed, but the damage was done. The pretense of friendly visitation had been stripped away, revealing the underlying tensions that Eric had been so carefully cultivating. Both groups of warriors now watched each other with open suspicion, and Jorund realized that violence was no longer a question of if, but when. As the afternoon progressed, he began making his own preparations. The Eastern gold hidden in his silk purse would soon need to be converted into more immediate forms of power. The time for subtle manipulation was ending, and the moment for decisive action was approaching faster than he had anticipated. The loaded dice had served their purpose admirably, but Jorund suspected that Eric had far more dangerous games in mind for the evening to come. That evening brought a shift in the atmosphere of Rigvol that even the most oblivious feast-goer could not ignore. The easy camaraderie of previous nights had been replaced by an undercurrent of tension so thick it seemed to press against the very walls of the hall. Eric's men sat clustered at their own tables, speaking in low voices and keeping their weapons close. Sigmar's warriors responded in kind, creating an armed camp within what should have been a place of hospitality. Jorund moved between the tables with heightened awareness, every sense alert to the danger that seemed to crackle in the smoky air. Hidden beneath his rough tunic, pressed against his ribs, lay a small knife he had carefully liberated from the kitchens earlier that day. It was a poor weapon compared to the swords that surrounded him, but it represented choice, the ability to act rather than simply observe when the moment came. The hidden weapon felt like a burning coal against his skin, a constant reminder that his days of passive observation were numbered. Eric's probing questions and calculated provocations were building toward something, and Jorund could feel the weight of approaching decision pressing down on him like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. "You're troubled tonight," Astrid observed as he refilled her cup. She had positioned herself strategically between the two groups of warriors, her intelligent eyes tracking the subtle movements and gestures that marked men preparing for potential violence. "Tension affects everyone, my lady," Jorund replied carefully. "Even thralls can sense when storms are gathering." She studied his face in the flickering firelight. "You speak of storms as if you've weathered many of them. Most slaves I've known fear conflict above all else. It's the free men who usually suffer when violence erupts. Perhaps some storms are worth facing," he said quietly, "when the alternative is living forever under clouded skies." Before Astrid could respond, Eric's voice cut through the murmur of conversation like a blade through silk. "My friends," the northern jarl called out, rising from his seat with the fluid grace of a predator, "I have a confession to make. My presence here is not entirely what it seems." The hall fell silent, except for the crackling of the central fire. Even the servants stopped their movements, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Jorund felt his muscles tense involuntarily, his hand moving unconsciously toward the hidden knife. "I came here hunting, yes," Eric continued, his pale eyes scanning the assembled warriors, "but not for common raiders. I seek a far more dangerous quarry, a ghost from the past who threatens to upset the careful peace we've all worked so hard to build." Sigmar's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "What ghost would that be, Eric?" "The son of Jorund Skallgrimsson," Eric replied with theatrical gravity. "Jorund, who should have died with his father 20 years ago, but instead escaped to the east. Intelligence from my trading contacts suggests he has returned, wealthy and dangerous, seeking to reclaim what he sees as his birthright." The revelation sent a shock through the hall like lightning. Warriors reached for weapons, servants pressed themselves against walls, and Jorund felt the world narrow to a single point of perfect clarity. Eric knew the hunt was over and the trap was closing, but Eric wasn't finished. This Jorund has spent 20 years learning Eastern ways, accumulating wealth and knowledge. He could be anyone, a merchant, a warrior, even a servant. As Eric spoke, his eyes swept the hall with calculated precision, pausing momentarily on various faces before moving on. When his gaze reached Jorund, it lingered for just a heartbeat longer than on the others, and Jorund saw the predatory satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "What do you propose?" Sigmar asked, his voice tight with the strain of maintaining diplomatic protocol while discussing the potential presence of his greatest enemy. "A test," Eric replied smoothly. "If this Jorund is indeed among us, his reaction to certain provocations should reveal his true nature. Men can disguise their faces and their voices, but they cannot disguise their hearts when confronted with the destruction of everything they hold dear." From a leather pouch at his side, Eric withdrew an object that made Jorund's blood turn to ice. It was a piece of wood, charred and blackened, but still recognizable, a fragment of his mother's writing desk, the place where she had composed the letters that had maintained his father's alliances and recorded the stories that had shaped Jorund's childhood. "I found this among Bjorn's possessions after his death," Eric announced, holding the fragment high for all to see, a piece of furniture that once belonged to his wife, crafted by her own father as a wedding gift. "I've carried it these 20 years as a reminder of what happens to those who oppose the natural order." Jorund felt something breaking inside his chest, a sound like ice cracking on a frozen lake. To see his mother's memory reduced to a trophy, a tool for Eric's psychological games, was almost more than his carefully maintained control could bear. But Eric wasn't finished with his cruelties. From the same pouch he produced other items, a silver bracelet that had belonged to Jorund's sister, a carved bone stylus his father had used for writing, fragments of a life systematically destroyed and preserved as tokens of victory. "If Jorund Skallgrim is indeed among us," Eric continued with mock sadness, "seeing these reminders of his family's fate should prove illuminating." The psychological assault was masterfully executed. Eric was using the deepest emotional connections Jorund possessed as weapons against him, betting that no man could maintain a disguise while watching his family's memory being defiled. Around the hall, eyes turned to scan faces for signs of reaction. Jorund felt the weight of dozens of gazes. The urge to reveal himself was almost overwhelming, but 20 years of discipline held firm. Eric's revelations had changed the game, but they had also revealed something crucial. The northern jarl was so confident he was willing to show his hand completely. "Interesting theory," Sigmar said carefully. "But how can you be certain this Jorund has returned? 20 years is a long time. He could be dead or simply uninterested in past grievances." "Oh, he's here," Eric replied with absolute certainty. "I can feel his presence like a wolf scenting blood on the wind. The question is not whether he's among us, but how long he thinks he can maintain his deception." As if to punctuate his words, Eric deliberately let the charred piece of wood slip from his fingers. It fell to the rushes and broke apart, scattering fragments of Jorund's heritage across the floor like refuse. The symbolism was unmistakable, the insult deliberate. Eric was not just hunting, he was baiting, trying to provoke a reaction that would expose his quarry. The broken pieces of his mother's desk seemed to whisper accusations from the floor, demanding vengeance for this final indignity. But Jorund remained motionless, though inside him something fundamental had shifted. Eric's games had revealed the true depth of his cruelty, the systematic way he had destroyed not just a family, but the very memory of their existence. This was no longer about reclaiming stolen property, or even achieving justice for past wrongs. This was about ensuring that such calculated evil never walked free again. As the evening progressed and Eric continued his psychological assault, Jorund began making final preparations. The hidden knife seemed to pulse against his ribs like a second heartbeat, while in his mind he catalogued every weapon in the hall, every exit, every potential ally and enemy. The time for patience was ending. Soon, very soon, the ghost of Jorund Skallgrim would walk again. The revelation came not through grand proclamation, but through a blood-stained letter that changed everything Jorund thought he knew about his father's death. As Eric continued his psychological assault, displaying the trophies of his family's destruction, a commotion erupted near the hall's entrance. A wounded messenger stumbled through the doors, his clothes torn and darkened with dried blood. He bore the colors of a minor jarl from the disputed borderlands, and his arrival immediately commanded attention from both groups of warriors. "My lords," the messenger gasped, collapsing to one knee before Sigmar's high table. "I bring urgent word from Jarl Thorvald of Ironhold. His lands are under attack by raiders claiming to serve Eric Bloodaxe." The accusation struck the hall like a thunderbolt. Eric's face transformed from predatory satisfaction to genuine confusion, his pale eyes narrowing as he processed this unexpected development. "Impossible," Eric said, his voice carrying the ring of absolute conviction. "My men are all here, accounted for. I've authorized no raids against Thorvald's holdings." The messenger struggled to his feet, pulling a crumpled parchment from his tunic. "Then perhaps you can explain this, my lord. It was found among the belongings of one of the raiders." He handed the letter to Sigmar, who unfolded it with careful hands. As the jarl read, his face grew increasingly grim. Finally, he looked up at Eric with an expression that mixed suspicion with dawning horror. "This bears your seal, Eric. It authorizes attacks on Ironhold and promises the writer that Thorvald's defeat will serve the greater good of clearing old debts. Eric snatched the letter, examining it with the intensity of a man whose life might depend on proving his innocence. As he read, Jorund watched the color drain from the northern jarl's face. "This is not my hand," Eric declared, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "The seal, it appears genuine, but I wrote no such orders." From his position among the servants, Jorund studied the letter with growing amazement. He had seen that handwriting before, years ago, in letters that had arrived at his father's hall, bearing false intelligence and manipulated information. The careful script belonged to someone who had been playing a much longer game than anyone realized. "May I see the letter, my lords?" Jorund asked quietly, stepping forward with the deference of a curious thrall. Both jarls looked at him with surprise. Slaves rarely spoke without permission, especially during matters of such importance. But something in Jorund's tone, perhaps a note of authority that had slipped through his carefully maintained facade, made Sigmar gesture for him to approach. Jorund examined the parchment carefully, his trained eye noting details that the others had missed. The paper was Eastern in origin, the ink mixed with a particular resin used in Byzantine scriptoriums, most telling of all, hidden in the margin. Where only someone looking for it would notice was a tiny mark, a raven drawn so small it appeared to be merely a stain. "This letter was not written by Eric Bloodaxe," Jorund announced with quiet certainty. "It was forged by someone seeking to turn you against each other." "How could a thrall know such things?" Gunnar demanded, his hand moving to his sword hilt. It was the moment Jorund had been building toward for days, the point where all deception would either triumph or crumble. He reached beneath his tunic and withdrew the signet ring that had hidden against his skin for 20 years. "Because," he said, his voice carrying the authority of nobility for the first time since his arrival, "I recognize the true hand that wrote it. The same hand that sent false letters to my father 20 years ago. Letters that convinced him to trust the wrong allies and meet Sigmar's delegation under false pretenses." The ring caught the firelight as he held it high, its carved surface displaying the raven of House Skallgrim for all to see. The effect on the hall was immediate and electric. Warriors reached for weapons, servants gasped in recognition, and Sigmar's face went white as ancient ice. "Jorund Skallgrimsson," the jarl whispered, "but you're supposed to be dead." "Death was certainly the plan," Jorund replied, his chains suddenly seeming more costume than bondage. "But plans change when you discover the true architect of your family's destruction." Eric had been studying the letter with growing comprehension, his predatory intelligence finally grasping the scope of the manipulation they had all endured. When he looked up at Jorund, there was something approaching respect in his pale eyes. "You've been playing us all," Eric said with grudging admiration. "But if you didn't forge this letter and I didn't write it, then who—" The answer came from an unexpected source. Ragnar the Wise, Sigmar's most trusted advisor, stepped forward with an expression of profound resignation. In his weathered hands, he carried a wooden chest that Jorund recognized with mounting dread. "I did," Ragnar said simply. "All of it. The letters that turned Bjorn against his allies, the false intelligence that led him to trust Sigmar's peace offer, the careful manipulations that brought down 2 great houses so that a third could rise." The confession hung in the smoky air like the tolling of funeral bells. Ragnar opened the chest, revealing correspondence spanning decades, each piece of parchment a thread in a web of deception so vast and intricate that it left even the most seasoned warriors speechless. "Why?" Sigmar's voice cracked with the weight of betrayal. "You were my father's closest friend, his most trusted advisor. Why would you orchestrate such destruction?" Ragnar's smile was sad and infinitely tired. "Because your father was weak and Bjorn was too honorable for his own good. Because Eric represented the old ways, strength through fear, rule through terror. I needed them all weakened, all dependent on guidance that would come from elsewhere." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horsemen echoed from outside the hall. The thunder of hooves on stone spoke of a large force arriving with purpose, and Jorund felt the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "You serve another master," he said with dawning understanding. "Someone who has been using all of us as pieces on a board we never even knew we were playing on." King Harald Fairhair, Ragnar confirmed with the relief of a man finally able to speak truth after decades of deception. "He seeks to unite all the northern jarls under his rule, but direct conquest would be too costly. Better to let the great houses destroy each other, then step in as the peacemaker who can restore order." The revelation recontextualized 20 years of history. Every betrayal, every alliance, every act of vengeance had been orchestrated by a mind that thought in terms of generations rather than seasons. Jorund, Eric and Sigmar had all been pawns in a game whose true stakes were nothing less than the future of the Norse lands. "The riders outside," Eric said with grim certainty. "Harald's men, his emissaries," Ragnar confirmed, "come to offer protection to the survivors of tonight's unfortunate conflict." But the old advisor had underestimated the men he had spent so long manipulating. Instead of the chaos he had orchestrated, his revelation had created something unexpected: unity forged in the crucible of shared betrayal. "Astrid," Sigmar called to his daughter, "take word to our allies. Tell them that Rigvol stands against Harald's expansion, whatever the cost." "Eric," Jorund said, extending his hand to the man who had hunted him across half the known world, "will you stand with us against the true enemy?" Eric studied the offered hand for a long moment, then grasped it firmly. 20 years of hatred dissolved by 20 minutes of truth. Harald Fairhair will discover that some games are more dangerous than others. As the three former enemies stood united against the approaching threat, Jorund felt the weight of his father's legacy settling on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a source of strength. The signet ring on his finger caught the firelight once more, no longer a symbol of loss, but a promise of restoration. The war horns that split the night air were not the chaotic braying of raiders, but the disciplined call of a royal army. From the windows of the great hall, Jorund could see torches spreading across the surrounding hills like fallen stars, each light representing mounted warriors in Harald's service. The king had not come merely to accept surrender. He had brought sufficient force to crush any resistance. "How many?" Sigmar asked Magnus, who had rushed in from the stables with intelligence gathered from the outer watchers. 300 horse, my lord, perhaps more. They've surrounded the settlement completely. No one enters or leaves without their permission." The numbers were sobering. Even with Eric's 50 warriors combined with Sigmar's household guard, they were outnumbered by more than 2 to 1. But Jorund had fought against worse odds in the eastern campaigns, and he knew that superior numbers meant nothing without proper leadership and coordination. "We have advantages they don't expect," Jorund said, moving to the great table where maps of the local terrain lay spread beneath oil lamps. "Harald's commanders think they're dealing with scattered, weakened jarls. They don't know we've united our forces." Eric leaned over the map, his tactical mind immediately grasping the possibilities. "The old mine shafts to the north, do they still connect to the cellars beneath this hall?" "They do," Sigmar confirmed. "And though we'd need someone who knows the passages well enough to guide men through in darkness." "I know them," Astrid said quietly from where she stood near the fire. "I explored every tunnel as a child, despite my father's warnings. I could lead a strike force through to attack their rear lines." The suggestion sparked immediate protest from several of the older warriors, but Jorund saw the strategic value in her proposal. More importantly, he recognized the steel in her voice. This was not a woman who would be easily dissuaded from her chosen course. "The passages are dangerous," Sigmar warned. "One wrong turn in the darkness, and you could wander for days before finding another exit." "Then we don't make wrong turns," Astrid replied with calm determination. 20 men through the tunnels, hitting their command position while you mount a frontal assault. Harold's forces will be caught between hammer and anvil, As they spoke, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of a herald bearing Harold's banner. The messenger was allowed to enter under traditional truce protocols, though every weapon in the hall remained within easy reach. King Harold Fairhair sends greetings to the jarls of Rigvol, the herald announced with practiced formality. His Majesty offers terms for your submission that are more generous than you have any right to expect. Speak your terms, Sigmar replied. Though his tone suggested little interest in negotiation, submit willingly, acknowledge Harold as your rightful king, and you will retain your holdings as his sworn vassals. Your people will be protected, your wealth preserved, your honor intact. This offer expires with the dawn. Eric's laugh was like the sound of steel on whetstone. And if we refuse these generous terms? The herald's expression remained professionally neutral. Then you will be swept aside like wheat before the scythe. Harold Fairhair has united every jarl from the western fjords to the eastern forests. Your resistance serves no purpose beyond ensuring your own destruction. Tell your king, Jorund said, stepping forward into the light where his face could be clearly seen, that the son of Jorund Skallgrimsson has returned to settle old debts. If he wants Rigvol, he can pay for it in blood. The herald's eyes widened with recognition. News of Jorund's return would clearly complicate Harold's calculations, introducing an unknown variable into what should have been a simple conquest. The king will be interested to learn of your survival, the herald said carefully. I'm sure he will want to discuss terms with you personally. The only terms I'm interested in discussing involve Harold's withdrawal from these lands, Jorund replied. We have nothing more to say. After the herald departed, the three former enemies turned their attention to detailed planning. The great hall was transformed into a war council, with maps spread across every available surface and weapons being distributed with careful attention to each warrior's strengths and preferences. The eastern approach is our strongest position, Eric observed, tracing defensive lines with his finger. If we can channel their main assault through the narrow pass between the hills, we can minimize their numerical advantage. Agreed, Jorund said, studying the terrain with the eye of a man who had fought battles from the Baltic to the Black Sea. But we need to control the timing. If they coordinate multiple attacks simultaneously, our defenses will be overwhelmed. The hours before dawn passed in a blur of preparation. Weapons were sharpened, armor checked, and final messages sent to family members who might not see another sunrise. The thralls, who had served in secret loyalty to Jorund's family, emerged from their concealment, revealing themselves as experienced warriors who had merely been waiting for the right moment to resume their true roles. Rolf, the former archer commander, assembled a company of bowmen with skills that would have been the envy of any royal guard. Magnus organized the cavalry with the precision of a man who understood that horses could be as decisive as steel in the right circumstances. Even old Olaf proved his worth, revealing a detailed knowledge of the surrounding terrain that came from decades of hunting in these hills. 20 years we've waited, Rolf said, as he strung his warbow with practiced ease. 20 years of pretending to be broken while our hearts burned for justice. Tonight, we fight not just for survival, but for the honor of our fallen lord. But it was the emergence of Ragnar's true loyalties that provided the most unexpected advantage. Faced with the reality of Harold's approaching army, the old advisor made a choice that surprised even himself. I've spent so many years serving others' ambitions that I'd forgotten what it felt like to choose my own path, Ragnar confessed as he helped plan the defense of the passages beneath the hall. Harold promised peace through unity, but what he offers is merely servitude dressed in royal colors. Why change sides now? Eric asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Ragnar considered the question carefully before answering. Because I've watched you three tonight, seen how enemies can become allies when faced with truth. Harold's way requires deception and manipulation. Perhaps it's time to try something different. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, the final preparations were completed. Astrid led her strike force into the tunnel entrance hidden beneath the kitchens, her knowledge of the underground passages serving as their guide through the labyrinthine darkness. Eric positioned his cavalry for a flanking maneuver that would exploit the confusion when the tunnel assault struck Harold's command position. Sigmar coordinated the main defensive line, ensuring that every archer had clear fields of fire and every spearman understood his role in the coming battle. Jorund stood at the Great Hall's entrance, watching Harold's forces array themselves for what should have been an overwhelming assault. The king's banners fluttered in the morning breeze, carried by warriors who had conquered every significant stronghold in the northern territories. They expected victory, and their confidence was visible in every movement, but confidence could be a weakness as well as a strength. Harold's commanders had planned for the conquest of scattered, demoralized enemies. They had not planned for the unified resistance of three great houses, fighting with the desperate fury of men who had finally learned the truth about their past. The war horns sounded again, this time from both sides of the battlefield. The time for planning was over, and the moment for action had arrived. As Jorund drew his father's sword from its hidden sheath retrieved from Sigmar's trophy room during the night's preparations, he felt the weight of 20 years settling on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. The ghost of Jorund Skallgrimsson was about to walk among the living once more. The attack began at first light with the methodical precision of a royal army. Confident in its superiority, Harold's forces advanced in disciplined formations, their shields locked in an overlapping wall that had broken the resistance of dozens of smaller jarls. War cries echoed across the valley as 300 mounted warriors began their assault on what they believed to be a doomed stronghold, but the defenders of Rigfall had prepared a reception that would shatter those expectations completely. The first surprise came when Harold's advance guard reached the narrow pass between the hills. What should have been a simple approach became a killing ground as hidden archers, led by Rolf's expert marksmanship, began picking off riders with deadly accuracy. The confined space that should have protected the attackers from flanking maneuvers instead became a trap that channeled them directly into prepared defensive positions. "Shield wall," Jorund commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years' worth of battlefield experience. "Let them come to us." The defenders formed their line with the fluid precision of men who had trained together for years rather than hours. Sigmar's household guard stood shoulder to shoulder with Eric's warriors and Jorund's newly revealed followers, their shields creating an unbroken barrier of iron and determination. Personal grievances and ancient feuds dissolved in the crucible of shared combat, replaced by the brotherhood that only exists between men facing death together. Harold's first charge struck the shield wall like a thunderclap, the impact sending shockwaves through both lines. Spears thrust through gaps in the defenses, while swords clashed against wooden shields in a symphony of violence that echoed across the valley. For long minutes, the outcome hung in the balance as superior numbers pressed against superior positioning. But Jorund had learned patience in the eastern campaigns, and he knew that the first assault was rarely the decisive one. As Harold's warriors pressed their attack with increasing desperation, he watched for the moment when their formation would begin to fray under the pressure of sustained combat. "Eric!" he called out over the din of battle. "Now!" The flanking cavalry charge erupted from concealment with devastating effect. Eric's mounted warriors struck Harold's exposed left flank like a hammer blow, their surprise assault rolling up the enemy line and creating chaos in what had been an orderly advance. The king's commanders, caught between the immovable defense and the unexpected cavalry charge, found their carefully planned assault dissolving into confused melee. For Jorund Skallgrimsson, Rolf's war cry rang out as his archers shifted their aim to support Eric's charge. For justice long delayed, the battle cry was taken up by voices throughout the defensive line. Men who had carried the memory of their fallen lord through 20 years of enforced silence, finally able to proclaim their true loyalty. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Harold's warriors suddenly found themselves fighting not against scattered enemies, but against the resurrected ghost of a house they had thought long dead. In the midst of the swirling combat, Jorund found himself face to face with one of Harold's champions, a giant of a man whose reputation for battlefield prowess was legend throughout the northern territories. The warrior's axe split the air with whistling force, each stroke capable of cleaving a man in half. But Jorund had learned his sword work in courts where failure meant death and excellence was the minimum standard for survival. The Eastern fighting techniques that had served him so well in distant campaigns proved equally effective against Norse axework. Where his opponent relied on brute strength and overwhelming force, Jorund employed precision and timing, his blade finding the gaps in armor with surgical accuracy. When the champion finally fell, his death sent a visible shock through Harold's forces. If their greatest warrior could be defeated, what hope did the rest have? But the true surprise was yet to come. From the rear of Harold's formation, shouts of alarm announced that Astrid's tunnel assault had reached its target. The king's command position, thought safely positioned beyond the reach of any assault, erupted in chaos as 20 determined warriors emerged from passages that Harold's scouts hadn't even known existed. The command tent, Eric shouted, pointing toward the confusion spreading through Harold's rear lines. They've struck the heart. The psychological impact was devastating. Harold's warriors, already shaken by the unexpected resistance, now found themselves fighting on multiple fronts with their leadership structure under direct attack. Orders became confused, formations began to break apart, and the disciplined advance transformed into desperate struggle for survival. Jorund pressed his advantage with the tactical instincts that had made him a legend in Byzantine military circles. "Forward," he commanded. "Drive them back while they're in confusion." The shield wall surged forward, no longer content to merely defend, but actively seeking to destroy the enemy force that had come to conquer them. Harold's warriors, caught between the advancing infantry and the chaos in their rear, found themselves trapped in a position from which retreat was as dangerous as continued combat. The tide of battle had turned completely, but Jorund knew that victory was not yet assured. Harold himself had yet to enter the fray, and the king's personal guard represented the elite of his military forces. The real test would come when the royal banner moved forward to restore order to the collapsing assault. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of war horns announced Harold's personal intervention. Through the smoke and chaos of the battlefield, Jorund could see the king's banner advancing, surrounded by the finest warriors in the northern territories. These were men who had conquered every significant stronghold, from the western fjords to the eastern forests. Veterans whose loyalty to Harold was absolute and whose skill was unquestioned. The moment of ultimate decision was approaching, and Jorund felt the weight of his father's legacy settling on his shoulders like a mantle of fire. Everything, his family's honor, his people's freedom, his own 20-year quest for justice, would be decided in the next few minutes of combat. The shield wall held firm as Harold's elite guard struck with the fury of men fighting for their king and their own survival. But now the defenders fought with something more powerful than mere skill or courage. They fought with the knowledge that justice, so long delayed, was finally within their grasp. The moment Jorund had waited 20 years to experience finally arrived as Harold Fairhair himself strode through the chaos of the battlefield, his personal guard clearing a path with ruthless efficiency. The king was smaller than legend suggested, but carried himself with the absolute confidence of a man who had never known defeat. In his hands he bore a sword that had conquered kingdoms, its blade reflecting the morning light like captured fire. But it was the weapon in Jorund's own grip that commanded attention, his father's sword, finally reclaimed from Sigmar's trophy room and restored to its rightful place in his hands. The blade had been forged by Eastern smiths using techniques unknown in the northern lands, its steel harder than iron and sharp enough to cut silk in mid-air. More importantly, it represented the continuity of his bloodline, the unbroken connection between past and present that no amount of political manipulation could sever. "So," Harold called out over the din of battle, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power, "the dead do rise again. Jorund Skallgrimsson returns to claim what was never rightfully his, what was stolen through treachery and maintained through deception." Jorund replied, advancing with measured steps. "My father died believing he was meeting friends under a flag of truce. Today, his son settles that debt." The two men circled each other while the battle raged around them, each seeking advantage in positioning and timing. Harold was a master swordsman whose skills had been honed in countless battles. But Jorund had learned techniques in the eastern courts that were unknown in these northern lands. "Your father was a fool who clung to outdated notions of honor," Harold said, testing Jorund's defenses with a series of quick strikes. "I offered unity, prosperity, peace under strong leadership. He chose division and weakness. He chose freedom over servitude," Jorund countered, his father's blade meeting Harold's with a ring of steel that echoed across the battlefield. "The prosperity you offer comes at the price of independence. The peace you promise is the silence of the grave." The combat that followed was a masterwork of swordplay, two warriors at the peak of their abilities, testing every skill they possessed. Harold fought with the brutal efficiency that had made him king, each stroke calculated to end the fight quickly and decisively. But Jorund's eastern training served him well, his movements flowing like water around Harold's attacks, while his own blade sought openings with surgical precision. Around them, the battle began to slow as warriors on both sides paused to watch their leaders settle the conflict that would determine all their fates. The outcome of this single combat would decide not just the immediate battle, but the future of the northern territories for generations to come. But Harold had not conquered half the known world through fair fighting alone. As the duel progressed, and it became clear that Jorund was his equal in skill, the king began employing the same treacherous tactics that had served him throughout his rise to power. A subtle gesture brought one of his guards forward, ostensibly to maintain the circle of combat, but actually to create a distraction at a crucial moment. When Jorund's attention shifted slightly to track the potential threat, Harold struck with vicious speed, his blade slicing across Jorund's shoulder in a wound that sent blood streaming down his arm. "Treachery runs deep in your nature," Jorund observed, switching his sword to his offhand with fluid grace. "Even in single combat, you cannot resist the urge to cheat." "I do whatever is necessary to achieve victory," Harold replied, pressing his advantage. "That is what separates kings from pretenders." But the king had underestimated both Jorund's ambidextrous training and his capacity for enduring pain. The shoulder wound, while bloody, was superficial, and fighting left-handed was a skill Jorund had mastered during his years in Byzantine service. When Harold moved in for what he thought would be the killing blow, Jorund's unexpected angle of attack caught him completely off guard. The eastern blade found its mark with devastating precision, sliding between the plates of Harold's armor to pierce his heart. The king's eyes widened in shock and disbelief as he realized that his conquest had ended not in triumph, but in his own destruction. "For Jorund Skallgrim," Jorund said quietly as Harold fell. "For justice finally served." The death of their king sent shockwaves through Harold's remaining forces. Without his presence to inspire them, without his tactical genius to guide them, the royal army began to fragment into individual units, more concerned with survival than victory. Some threw down their weapons and sought quarter. Others attempted to fight their way out of the encirclement. But none maintained the disciplined resistance that might have salvaged something from the disaster. As the sun reached its zenith, the Battle of Rigvol was over. Harold Fairhair, the would-be uniter of the northern territories, lay dead on the field he had thought to conquer. His dream of empire had died with him, leaving the independent jarls free to determine their own destinies once more. Standing over his fallen enemy, Jorund felt the weight of 20 years lifting from his shoulders. His father's sword, no longer just a symbol of loss, had become an instrument of justice. The ghost of Jorund Skallgrimsson could finally rest in peace, knowing that his son had restored honor to their family name. 3 months after the battle that had changed the fate of the northern territories, Jorund stood in the rebuilt Great Hall of Rigvol, watching as the final preparations were made for a ceremony that would have seemed impossible just seasons before. The hall bore new tapestries now, woven with threads that combined the symbols of 3 great houses, the Raven of Skallgrim, the Wolf of Eric's line, and the Oak Tree of Sigmar's family. But the most prominent symbol was something entirely new, a ring forged from metal, taken from all 3 family treasures, representing an alliance born not from conquest, but from mutual respect and shared struggle. The new alliance ring sat on a place of honor at the high table, its surface gleaming with the soft luster of gold, silver, and iron worked together by the finest smiths in the territory, unlike the ornate drinking horns and ancestral weapons that had once divided these families. This simple band represented something unprecedented, a bond forged in truth rather than deception, strengthened by conflict rather than weakened by it. "Hard to believe it's only been 3 months, Eric observed, settling into the chair that had been reserved for him at Jorund's right hand. "Seems like a lifetime since we were trying to kill each other." "Some lessons take longer to learn than others," Jorund replied with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally found his place in the world. "My father always said that the strongest alliances were those tested by fire before they were sealed in friendship." Sigmar approached from where he had been greeting the last of the arriving guests, representatives from dozens of neighboring jarls who had come to witness this unprecedented gathering. His face bore new lines carved by the stress of recent months, but also a peace that came from finally understanding the truth about his own past. "The last of Harald's former supporters have arrived," Sigmar reported. "They seem genuinely interested in joining our confederation, rather than seeking revenge for their fallen king." It had taken considerable diplomacy to convince Harald's scattered followers that the new alliance offered them better prospects than continued resistance. Many had initially sought to avenge their king's death, but Ragnar's revealed correspondence had exposed the extent to which they too had been manipulated. Faced with evidence of Harald's deceptions and offered genuine partnership rather than conquest, most had chosen cooperation over continued conflict. "What news from the southern borders?" Eric inquired, his strategic mind never far from considerations of defense and security. "Peaceful," Astrid replied as she joined them. Her presence at these discussions no longer a matter of controversy, but acknowledged necessity. Her leadership during the tunnel assault had earned her a place at the council table that transcended traditional expectations of women's roles. The traders report that word of Harald's defeat has spread throughout the territories. Several jarls are sending envoys to discuss potential alliances. The ripple effects of that single battle had indeed spread far beyond anyone's initial expectations. Harald's death had not just freed the immediate territories from his expansion, it had demonstrated that unified resistance could succeed against seemingly overwhelming odds. The lesson had not been lost on other regions facing similar pressures from would-be conquerors. As the sun set behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley that had witnessed such momentous changes, Jorund found himself reflecting on the strange paths that had led to this moment. The man who had arrived in chains just months before now wore the restored regalia of his house. But the true transformation went far deeper than mere symbols of rank. "Do you ever wonder?" Astrid asked quietly, joining him at the great window that overlooked the settlement. "Or what would have happened if you had simply revealed yourself that first night? If you had chosen direct confrontation rather than patient observation?" Jorund considered the question with the thoughtfulness that had become his trademark. "We would have fought, certainly. Blood would have been spilled, honor defended, revenge taken. But I don't think we would have learned what we needed to know about ourselves and each other." "Which was?" that the greatest victories are not won through strength alone, but through understanding. That true justice requires wisdom as well as courage. That some enemies become the strongest allies when they finally see past their own assumptions. The ceremony that followed was unlike any that had been witnessed in the Northern Territories. Instead of a traditional feast celebrating conquest or displaying wealth, it was a gathering focused on mutual commitment and shared purpose. The alliance ring was passed from hand to hand, each jarl adding his oath to the compact that would govern their cooperation. When the ring finally returned to Jorund, he held it high for all to see. "This represents something new," he declared, his voice carrying clearly through the packed hall. "Not the dominion of one house over others, but the partnership of equals working toward common goals. We have learned that deception breeds only more deception, that manipulation creates enemies where there should be friends. To the Alliance," Eric called out, raising his cup in salute. "To justice restored." Sigmar added, "To the future," Astrid concluded, her voice strong with conviction. As the celebration continued around them, Jorund stepped outside into the cool evening air, needing a moment of solitude to fully process the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The stars above were the same ones that had shone down on his father's hall 20 years before, but everything else had changed beyond recognition. From the darkness, a familiar voice spoke quietly. "He would have been proud of you." Jorund turned to find old Ragnar approaching, his weathered face showing the peace that came from finally serving a cause he believed in, rather than merely following orders from distant masters. "My father believed in honor above all else," Jorund replied, "but I think he would have been more proud of the fact that we chose mercy over vengeance. When we had the power to destroy our enemies completely, perhaps that's the difference between justice and revenge," Ragnar observed. "Justice seeks to restore balance, while revenge seeks only to inflict pain. You've built something that will outlast all of us." As they stood together in the starlight, listening to the sounds of celebration echoing from the hall, Jorund felt the last of the weights that had burdened him for 20 years, finally lifting from his shoulders. The ghost of his father could indeed rest in peace now, knowing that his son had not only restored their family's honor, but had used that restoration to build something greater than mere personal vindication. The alliance ring, symbolic of bonds forged in truth rather than deception, would endure long after the men who had created it were gone. And in the halls where children would grow up hearing stories of the great battle of Rigvol, they would learn that the greatest victories were not won through conquest, but through the courage to transform enemies into allies. The feast continued until dawn, but Jorund knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The work of building lasting peace would require the same patience and wisdom that had brought them to this moment. But for the first time in 20 years, he faced that future not as an exile seeking justice, but as a leader ready to help shape a better world for the generations that would follow.